When you decide to cut someone off, the guilt doesn't show up quietly. It arrives loudly, dressed as self-doubt, shame, and second-guessing. It whispers, maybe you're overacting. Maybe you should give them one more chance. Maybe you're the problem. But guilt is not always the voice of truth. Sometimes it's the echo of old conditioning, an internal script that says your worth is measured by how much you can tolerate, how much you can forgive, how much you can endure. Here's the truth we don't say enough. Guilt often arrives dressed as authority, carrying the tone of certainty, as if it has the final say on whether you've done something wrong. But guilt is not always the voice of truth. Sometimes it's just the residue of old expectations, old roles, and old rules you were taught to follow. When you cut someone off, even for your own well-being, guilt can appear instantly. Not because you made the wrong choice, but conditioned you were to believe self-protection is selfish, boundary setting is rude, and prioritizing your peace is something you must justify. Guilt is powerful not because it is accurate, but because it is familiar. Many people were raised to keep the peace, to accommodate others, to avoid conflict at all costs. And nosing away from someone, even when necessary, is framed as a failure rather than act of self-respect. So when you finally take a step to protect yourself, guilt can misinterpret that courage as wrongdoing. It's important to understand that guilt often reflects internalized responsibilities that were never yours to carry. You may feel guilty because someone else's disappointment feels like your fault. You may feel guilty because you were taught to absorb other people's emotions, to fix everything, to make everyone comfortable, even when it costs you your own comfort. You may feel guilty because you were conditioned to stay loyal to people who did not stay loyal to you. But none of that guilt is grounded in truth, it is grounded in programming. When guilt rises after you cut someone off, it is not a sign that the decision was wrong. It is a sign that your boundaries are evolving faster than your self-permission to have them. It reveals the gap between your healed self and your conditioned self, the part of you that knows you deserve peace, and the part of you that feels unworthy of choosing it. Sometimes guilt appears not because of what you did, but because you stopped doing what was harming you. You stopped explaining yourself to someone committed to misunderstanding you. You stopped shrinking to make someone else comfortable. You stopped giving chances that were only ever used against you. Guilt is often just the echo of old roles that no longer fit. The truth is that guilt can lie. It can confuse familiarity with rightness. It can mistake discomfort for wrongdoing. It can make you question choices that were necessary for your mental and emotional safety. But when you look deeper, guilt is often just fear. Fear of being judged, of being misunderstood, fear of disappointing someone who never considered how much they disappointed you. The real truth is simply you are allowed to walk away from people who hurt you, drain you, confuse your spirit, or disrupt your peace. You are allowed to choose your well-being without apologizing for it. Guilt may speak loudly, but it is not the judge of your integrity. Sometimes the bravest choice you can make is to stop letting guilt dictate your life and start letting truth guide it. Protecting your peace is one of the most courageous decisions you can make, yet it's often one of the hardest to justify to yourself. We are raised to believe that being a good person means being endlessly available, endlessly forgiving, endlessly understanding. We learn to measure our worth by how much we can give, how much we can absorb, and how much we can tolerate. So when the moment comes to step back, to create distance, or to cut someone off for the sake of your own well-being, it can feel wrong, even though it's the most right thing you've done for yourself in a long time. The truth is that protecting your peace isn't selfish. It isn't cruel. It isn't unkind. It's an act of responsibility. Responsibility to your mental health, your emotional clarity, your sense of stability, and your ability to function in the world without constant chaos draining your energy. Peace is not a luxury. It is a necessity. You cannot think clearly, love deeply, or grow authentically when you are surrounded by people who disrupt your equilibrium. Your nervous system knows when you're unsafe. Your mind knows when you're overwhelmed. Your body knows when you've stayed too long in a place that keeps breaking you. Choosing peace means honoring those signals instead of ignoring them. People often fear that protecting their peace will create conflict or hurt feelings, and sometimes it will, but temporary discomfort is not the same as wrongdoing. You cannot build a healthy life around other people's expectations, demands, or emotional instability. You cannot sacrifice your well-being simply because someone else refuses to take responsibility for their behavior. Protecting your peace means acknowledging that you have limits, and that those limits deserve respect, including from yourself. You are allowed to limit access to your energy. You are allowed to step back from people who drain you, confuse you, manipulate you, or make you question your worth. You are allowed to stop explaining yourself to people who refuse to understand you. You are allowed to walk away from conversations that always end in the same pain. You are allowed to choose a quieter, calmer, safer life. Protecting your peace is also a form of self-respect. It says, I matter. It says, my inner world is worth safeguarding. It says, I will no longer abandon myself to make someone else comfortable. When you choose peace, you choose to stop participating in dynamics that keep you small, afraid, or emotionally exhausted. You choose the kind of environment where you can breathe, heal, and become who you're meant to be. And yes, people may accuse you of being distant, cold, or selfish, but people who depend on your lack of boundaries will always see your boundaries as a threat. Their reactions say nothing about your character and everything about the role your silence once played in their comfort. Protecting your peace is not wrong. It is necessary, it is brave, and most importantly, it is your right, one no one else gets to approve, validate, or negotiate. Ending a relationship is rarely a spontaneous decision. It is almost never the result of one argument, one misunderstanding, or one bad moment. More often, it is the quiet conclusion reached after months or even years of trying to communicate, trying to understand, trying to fix what keeps breaking, trying to hold together something that has long stopped holding you. People don't walk away because they don't care. They walk away because caring alone stopped being enough to make the relationship healthy, safe, or sustainable. Before someone reaches the point of ending a relationship, they usually exhaust every internal resource they have. They replay conversations in their mind, wondering if they could have said something differently. They bend, stretch, accommodate, forgive, and compromise, hoping something will shift. They convince themselves to be patient a little longer. They give second chances, fifth chances, sometimes more. They rationalize red flags. They silence their own discomfort to maintain harmony. Ending a relationship is not the first option, it's the last option when all the earlier options have failed to create change. Many people end relationships with a heavy heart, not a hardened one. They don't walk away unscathed. They walk away tired. They walk away grieving the potential that never became reality. They walk away after realizing they can no longer negotiate their self-worth in exchange for connection. They walk away not because they stopped loving, but because they started noticing the cost of staying. And sometimes that cost is too high. Emotional exhaustion, loss of identity, constant anxiety, or a growing sense that you're betraying yourself to keep someone else comfortable. What often goes unseen is the internal battle leading up to that final choice. There's the guilt of letting go, the fear of loneliness, the uncertainty of what comes next, and the mourning of memories that still feel warm. There's the hope that things might magically improve. There's the denial that whispers, maybe it's not that bad. There's the loyalty that insists you owe it to them to stay. But slowly, a deeper truth begins to surface. You also owe something to yourself. Ending a relationship becomes necessary when the connection consistently brings more harm than healing. When communication becomes a battleground, when trust erodes, when respect fades, when patterns repeat without accountability, or when your emotional safety is compromised, is the moment you realize that preserving the relationship requires sacrificing your peace, your dignity, or your growth, and that is too high a price to pay. Even then, the decision is rarely made with cold certainty. It's made with trembling hands, a fragile voice, and a heart that still wishes things were different. But ending a relationship is not a failure. It is an act of honesty. It is the recognition that love cannot thrive without respect and reciprocity. Choosing to end a relationship is choosing truth over illusion, growth over stagnation, and self-respect over self-abandonment. It is the final doorway you walk through when every other door has already closed. Guilt is often misunderstood as proof that you've done something wrong, but in reality, guilt can also be a sign that you're evolving beyond old patterns and stepping into a healthier version of yourself. When you set boundaries, walk away from harmful relationships, or stop tolerating behavior that once felt normal, it's natural for guilt to surface. This guilt doesn't mean the choice was wrong. It often means the choice was new. And anything new, especially anything that challenges long-standing habits of self-sacrifice or people-pleasing, will feel uncomfortable at first. The reason guilt feels so heavy is because growth requires you to break the unspoken rules you've lived by for years. Maybe you were taught to always be available, to never disappoint people, to keep the peace at any cost. Maybe you believed that putting yourself first was selfish, or that loyalty meant staying no matter how much it hurt. When you start unlearning these beliefs, guilt shows up as a reminder of who you used to be, not who you are becoming. It's a sensation of your old identity trying to pull you back into familiar roles, even when those roles were damaging or limiting. Guilt can also show up when you stop overextending yourself. If you've lived your life giving too much, apologizing too often, or carrying emotional weight that wasn't yours, choosing yourself will feel foreign. You may feel guilty for saying no, for stepping back, or for no longer tolerating behavior that once exhausted you. But that guilt is a sign that your internal boundaries are shifting. You are teaching your nervous system that your well-being matters. You are learning that self-respect is not a punishment to others. It's a responsibility you owe to yourself. Sometimes guilt appears because you are breaking generational patterns. If your family normalized silence, endurance, or pretending everything was fine, choosing truth and emotional safety will feel rebellious. Growth often triggers guilt because you're stepping outside the expectations that shaped you. But the presence of guilt doesn't mean you're wrong. It means you're doing something no one before you modeled. It means you're healing cycles instead of repeating them. Another reason guilt can be a sign of growth is that it shows your capacity for empathy. You care. You don't want to hurt anyone. You don't take decisions lightly. But empathy becomes a trap when it's used against you or when it keeps you in places that diminish you. Growth requires learning the difference between compassion and self-abandonment. Guilt may rise as you make that distinction, but with time, clarity follows. As you grow, guilt eventually transforms into understanding. You begin to see that choosing your mental and emotional health is not selfish. It's necessary. You realize that walking away from chaos, manipulation, or disrespect is not cruel. it's wise. And you recognize that the discomfort of guilt is temporary, but the damage of staying in unhealthy situations is lasting. Guilt is not always an enemy. Sometimes it is the tremor that happens when you step out of the old version of yourself and into the new one. It's the sign that you are changing, healing, and finally choosing yourself in ways you never had the strength to choose before. When you choose to distance yourself from someone, especially when that choice is rooted in self-protection, boundaries, or emotional clarity, misunderstanding is almost guaranteed. People rarely see your history, your private struggles, or the silent efforts you made to keep the relationship alive. They only see the moment you step back. And because most people interpret life through the lens of their own needs, wounds, and expectations, they create stories that make sense to them, not stories that reflect the truth. Misunderstanding happens because people see your actions, not your reasons. They don't see the nights you lay awake replaying conversations. They don't see the efforts you made to communicate. They don't see the boundaries you tried to set with kindness. They don't see the warning signs you ignored or the hurt you carried quietly. All they see is the distance. And distance to someone who relied on your closeness can feel like betrayal, even if stepping away was the only way to stay emotionally safe. It's also inevitable because many people value comfort over honesty. When you change your role in someone's life, it disrupts their expectations. If they were used to you being available, agreeable, or forgiving, your boundaries will feel like rejection to them. They may call you cold, dramatic, or selfish, not because you are any of those things, but because your growth invalidates the version of you that once served them. They misunderstand not because you communicated poorly, but because your transformation threatens the equilibrium that benefited them. And sometimes people misunderstand because they simply don't want to understand. Accountability is uncomfortable. Facing their own behavior requires self-reflection. It's easier to label you as the problem than admit the ways they contributed to the relationship's breakdown. Misunderstanding becomes a shield, one that protects their ego but distorts your truth. It's natural to want to defend yourself, to correct their assumptions, to make them see your heart clearly. But growth often requires accepting that not everyone will understand your decisions, your boundaries, or your healing process. You cannot control someone else's narrative. You cannot force them to see your pain, your effort, or your reasons. You can only honor what you know within yourself. Part of maturing emotionally is learning that your truth doesn't need universal approval. You don't need a courtroom of witnesses to justify the choices you made to protect your peace. The people who are meant for you will seek clarity, not cling to assumptions. They will ask, not accuse. They will not defend. They will care enough to understand the full picture, not just the parts that make them comfortable. Misunderstanding is not a reflection of your character. It is a reflection of perspective, bias, and personal limits. You cannot live your life trying to prevent misinterpretation. If you do, you will shrink yourself endlessly. Instead, trust that the people who deserve access to you will work to understand you, and the people who don't will misunderstand you, no matter how carefully you explain. Let them misunderstand. Your peace is worth more than their version of your story. Choosing yourself is one of the bravest acts you can commit to, especially when you've spent much of your life prioritizing others. For many people, self-sacrifice is not just a habit. It's an identity. You become the one who fixes, who absorbs, who stays available, who smooths edges of every conflict, who carries the emotional weight no one else wants to hold. So when the moment comes to choose your well-being, your boundaries, your truth, or your healing, it doesn't always feel courageous at first. It feels foreign. It feels risky. It feels like stepping into a light you've never believed you deserved. Choosing yourself means listening to the whisper of your inner voice over the noise of external expectations. It means honoring your needs even when others dismiss them. It means acknowledging your pain instead of burying it under the pressure to appear strong. It means saying no when you used to automatically say yes. It means walking away from situations that drain your spirit, even if part of you still loves the people in them. What makes this choice courageous is not it's that it's honest. It requires you to confront truths you've avoided, like the reality that not everyone in your life has your best interests at heart, or the fact that you've stayed in relationships out of habit, fear, or guilt rather than genuine alignment, or the reality that your own patterns, overgiving, people-pleasing, self-neglect, have played a role in keeping you stuck. Choosing yourself demands a level of self-awareness that many people spend their whole lives resisting. It also takes courage because choosing yourself sometimes requires disappointing others. You may be judged, misunderstood, or labeled as selfish by people who benefited from your lack of boundaries. When you stop bending, people who were comfortable with your flexibility may feel threatened. When you stop absorbing emotional responsibility, those who relied on your softness may feel abandoned. And when you start valuing your peace, those who thrived in your chaos may claim you've changed in all the wrong ways. But choosing yourself is not about abandoning others. It's about refusing to abandon yourself. It's about recognizing that you cannot pour a cup that is always empty, that you cannot show up authentically when you're exhausted, and that you cannot create meaningful connections when you're chronically disconnected from yourself. It's about realizing that your needs are not negotiable, and that your well-being is not optional. Over time, choosing yourself becomes a declaration: my life matters, my mental health matters, my boundaries matter, my happiness matters. And once you make that choice, even in the smallest ways, something shifts inside you. You begin to feel more grounded, more stable, more aligned. You begin to trust yourself again. You begin to build a life rooted not in survival, but in intention. Choosing yourself is courageous because it is an act of reclaiming your power. It is the moment you decide that your story, your peace, and your future are worth protecting, even when the world around you doesn't understand.